Hi, welcome back. Here we are on our second round, or that second portion of our thesis. We're going to begin to make our way through a series of modules on data collection and analysis. And as you'll notice, over the next several weeks, we will go more in depth on data collection and analysis. Let's just take a quick stock of where we are. Obviously, on the first 8 weeks of this course, we've done our problem statement and our purpose. We've also gotten through that literature review, praise the Lord. And we've made our way partially through our methods section. So where do we go next? So what's left? We're about halfway home. We've got our chapter 1 done. Our chapter 2 lit review is complete. We have begun our work on that chapter 3. So obviously that will be our next step in completing that methods section. Then we'll move on to chapter 4, where we'll talk about our results and report our findings. Finally, in chapter 5, we'll begin to talk about our discussion and conclusion. As we end on this section, or this section of this course, we'll also move towards talking about where and what ways we can apply and use our research in a grander scale, for example, at conferences and in scholarly journals. So what's left? Again, we've got that chapter 1 completed. Our chapter 2 lit review is done. We have begun work on chapter 3, and therefore we'll be finishing chapter 3 over the next 8 weeks. In addition to, we'll be reporting our findings in chapter 4. That's where we'll spend the next several weeks talking about how we're going to use our data. And then finally, we'll be discussing our findings and offering a conclusion in chapter 5. In addition, over the next 8 weeks, we'll be thinking about where we may want to present our research. I want to first start off and talk about some preliminary data analysis preparation. There are a couple of things I want to ensure that we think about as we begin to prep our data. First of all, are there any anomalies? I want to make sure that we think about our data being legible, complete, consistent, and accurate. And if it isn't, we need to stop and rethink or readjust our data. Secondly, in kind of that data analysis prep, I want you to think about coding your data. What does that mean? For quantitative data, it makes it easier if we somewhat think about putting our data into piles or assigning a number to those predetermined responses. For those of you doing qualitative research, those piles, I'll say, become even much more helpful when we think about qualitative work. It allows us to consolidate, list, and get that data together in working areas. All of this is just so that we begin to think about that really before we can even begin to analyze the data at its core, we need to make sure it's in working areas, or piles, I like to call it. Our next area for consideration on our data analysis preparation is this notion of scales of measurements. Before we go on and discuss the ways that we will statistically analyze, we have to determine the scale or the level of measurement of each variable we're going to have. First is a nominal scale. This is the indication where there's no order, but we simply give a name or a label to our categories. Ordinal, on the other hand, puts the data in an order. Potentially we could say maybe ranking or finishing and so on. Interval scales have what we would call equivalent intervals between measurements. They can have negative numbers and they may actually have a 0. Last one is our ratio. Ratio scales are based on order and possess equal intervals of measurement, but they're also proportional. They also have a non-arbitrary 0, and they cannot include negative numbers. Let's go on and talk about some descriptive statistics. Descriptive statistics allow us or provide ways in which we can describe or summarize our data. There are obviously four ways to think about this: measures of central tendency, variability, relative position, and relationship. Let's first start with central tendency. This measure allows the researcher to describe a set of data with a single numerical value. It typically represents the average or the value associated with the dataset. A couple of ways or things that are commonly seen with central tendency are that mean, median, and mode. Next is measures of variability. This measure gives an indication of how scores are spread around that mean or that other measure of central tendency. The most common measures of variability are range, standard deviation, and variance. Third, we have measures of relative position. These measures give us an indication of where a specific score is in location to the rest of the scores in the distribution. And finally, our measures of relationship. These measures indicate the degree to which our variables are related to each other. Oftentimes, descriptive statistics again are used as a way to describe or summarize our data. They're particularly helpful when we're talking about our participants or our population pool. Descriptive statistics allows us ways to describe or summarize our data. Inferential statistics are going to give us ways to use our data to draw conclusions. First of all, let's talk about statistical significance. Researchers use statistical significance in order to report their findings as important. Significance levels are used with our inferential statistics to make judgments about whether to accept or reject that null hypothesis. When we make correct assumptions about our null hypothesis, we have where we state the null hypothesis is actually true and we've concluded that it's true. The null hypothesis is actually false and we concluded that it's false. However, there may be measures of error. When we do so, that becomes a type 1 or type 2 error. Let's clarify. A type 1 error is when the null hypothesis is actually true and the researcher concludes it's false, or conversely, type 2 error is when the null hypothesis is actually false and our researcher concludes that it's true. Above all, the researchers strive to avoid type 1 errors, since claiming a significant difference exists when it is not especially undesirable. Let's talk about statistical power. Power is the essence of every researcher's goal, and it means it's the ability to detect a difference when it truly exists. And finally, let's talk about effect size. Effect size is an objective and standardized measure of magnitude of the observed effect. Most common ways that we measure this effect size is Cohen's d and Pearson's correlation coefficient. We'll be talking more about this at length over the next couple weeks in modules 2, 3, and 4. I want to draw your attention to a brief discussion about statistical design. In your text in table 5.1, there's a statistical test decision-making tree. It is essentially a consideration of these components of identifying our variables, determining and indicating which variables are independent, dependent, or covariate, determine the type of all of our variables, the purpose of the research question, and then applying that information to this decision-making tree. It is super helpful, again, table 5.1, in helping us determine those group differences and ultimately prediction of group membership, as well as the structure of our statistical design. For visual learners, additionally, this chart provides a very helpful way to see statistical design laid out. As we begin to think about writing or finishing up our methods section, I want us to have some examples. In our assigned readings, you are assigned an article called Social Media Scholarship in Sport Management Research. a critical review by Abeza et al. And under the methods, I want to draw specific attention to that data collection and how this research was conducted, or how the data, was collected. Also, in addition, I like how Abeza et al. Lays out their data analysis procedures using inductive and deductive analysis. I think this article, and research provides a great example for you when you begin to work on your methods section on how a data collection section appears on a scholarly research article, as well as that data analysis section as it's written out. Use this for your reference. In addition to Abeza et al.'s article, I want to draw your attention to another assigned article from the readings for the module. Dr. Frisbee writes an article called The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, Critical Sport Management Research. The premise of this article in many ways is this analysis, or thinking outside the good, our go-to with sport. I also want us to think about how we can use our data, because it ultimately will help us analyze a topic. And in doing so, Frisbee wants us to think outside the good, in that we need to be more concerned with just this notion of wealth creation or profit for an organization, but we need to be thinking about or being concerned with those representing the interests of those impacted, and that may be participants in sport and physical activity, it may be coaches, it may even be organizations. But nonetheless, with our construction of data and ultimately the analysis of data, I want us to have a little bit of the mindset of thinking outside the good. Again, use Kirby's article as an example to help guide you in some of this thinking. All right, we've made our way to the end of Module 1. I want to give a few summing up points. First of all, hopefully you're recognizing that data analysis is very systematic. It needs to be procedural, it needs to be followed, all the T's need to be crossed and all the I's need to be dotted. But in that also, we need to think about it as critical. I want to refer back to Frisbee's article and thinking outside the good. The purpose of doing systematic procedural research is so that we can provide critical thinking on the results.